progress.
Today we're going to be learning Beitzah Daf Lamedaled. Today's daf is sponsored by Eran Belin and Marcy Goldstein in memory of Rabbi David Eliach. He was a founding member of the Yeshiva Flatbush and taught generations of students to love Torah and serious study. He was my principal as well. I give him a lot of credit for my early education. Okay. Now we are going to start our daf. Registration, I said, would be up yesterday. It's only going up today, but registration will be up today. You can register for the Siyum. So everyone can go on the site later today and register. You'll get a link to the Zoom directly. Okay, we have a new system that we used the last time there was a Siyum that you register through Zoom, and then you get the link directly on your own. We will not be sending the link out like we have done in the past, because it's a new registration system, so you all get your own link, and therefore everyone needs to register, and then you'll get a link. If you have any sort of issue, obviously, send us an email. Okay, we saw it yesterday. We finished with this Eimel Abnimet HaRa'afim. If you remember, we were talking about lighting a fire, and then we said you also can't heat up one of your roof tiles to cook on it because of one of two potential problems. There were two different versions of what Rabbi Yochanan said. One was that the reason is because they're new, and by doing that, they might burst, and smash to pieces, in which case you'll have done something for no purpose at all. And if you're going to actually cook on it, great. But if there's a chance it's going to burst, and a good chance because it's brand new, you've never used it, and therefore you're not allowed to do that. Some people say, mipnei shetzarich lechasman. Because, again, if it's new, what's the problem? It needs to be hardened, and the first heating of it, as you heat it the first time, that hardens it, and then that's like making a vessel. So it's like the makebe patish, the final blow on making a vessel. So therefore, it's either one or the other. We're now going to see the rest of the continuation of the sugya is going to relate first to one and then to the other answer here. Tanan hatam. So now we quote a Mishnah. We're at the top of Lamedaled. Quote a Mishnah from a totally different place. Chulin. The issue is slaughtering an animal when it might be a treifa. Okay, again, a treifa is an animal that's sick. Okay, that has some sort of problem. There's a list of all the potential treifot in Chulin. So the Gemara says here, quotes from the Mishnah, Chulin drasa. We're talking about a bird that gets trampled on. O shetrafa bekotel, or it got smashed into a wall. O sheritzatzta behemara, or an animal trampled over it, or kicked it around. Umifarkeset, and it's flailing. V'shahata me'elei, but then it lasted 24 hours. It didn't die in the next 24 hours. So the question is, are you allowed to shecht it? So the Mishnah says, shachata kshera. If you shecht it, it's kosher. Because you can assume it didn't die from that incident. It didn't necessarily become a treifa from there. However, Amar Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Yanai, he limits this, and he says, Mishum Rabbi Elazar ben Antuginus. So Rabbi Elazar, the son of Yanai, said in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Antuginus, Sricha bedika. After you slaughter that bird, you have to check it. And so you have to, right? You don't always have to check the bird. In this case, you have to check the insides to make sure that everything was working properly. There wasn't some sort of treifa, right? Like there's different simanim that it could be that you could find after death. You have to check those to make sure it wasn't a treifa. So now, maybe you can already get the connection. By mine Rabbi Yirmiyah mi Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked Rabbi Zera the following question: Mahu l'shochta b'Yom Tov? Are you allowed to slaughter this kind of bird on Yom Tov? Because mi machzikinam reuta b'Yom Tov olo. If we have reason to believe that the animal or the bird or whatever it is might be a treifa, then, in other words, it's all a matter of what are the chances. If there's a high probability that this animal will be a treifa, like this one, like the one that was pushed around and had some issues already and it was flailing, and yet it lasted 24 hours, but there's a strong chance that maybe there's a treifa that after, and that's again, you can only check once you slaughter the animal, and you can open it up and see the insides. So are you allowed to slaughter that on Yom Tov? Do you have to say, maybe there's a good chance this is going to be a treifa, in which case what happened? You just did a melacha of shchita lilo shum tzorech, for no purpose, just like the ra'afim, right? Where you heated it up and in the end it burst, right? So they say, that's his question. Do we hold a reuta or not? Reuta means, right, it's falling up, weak, like this weak bird, that maybe there's a problem. So Amarle, what does he say? Let's take it from the Rafim case. Tanina, it says in the Mishnah, you can't heat up the rafim, the tiles, in order to roast on them. And then they asked, "My kavi, what's the problem?" Meaning you can't do it because you'll end up having to check it. In which case, he says to Rabbi Yirmiyah, there's your answer. It's the exact same situation. Obviously, you wouldn't be allowed to slaughter this bird. To which Rabbi Yirmiyah said to him, Amar lei, I don't accept your answer because we learned the version of the answer that Rabbi Yochanan gave was the other answer, that the problem is not that we're worried it's going to burst and you'll end up doing melacha for no reason. We hold by the other reason that you're actually turning it into a utensil. By doing that, you're heating it up and you're hardening it, and that's the problem. And I don't think the other thing is a problem, which means I don't accept your answer. Okay? And that's the end of their discussion. You don't really hear what happens after that. So there's a good nafkamina, right, where you would have a difference for halacha, right, when it comes to the rafim, new ones, no matter what. Either it's that or it's that. But here's a relevant practical ramification of, depending on which way you hold, what you would say, are you allowed to slaughter? And as normally we allow you to slaughter an animal, you could say this theoretically. Any animal could potentially be a treifa, and then you can't slaughter animals on Yom Tov at all. But again, right, and this is something we keep saying all along, is there's a balancing game, right? On the one hand, we want to allow you simchat Yom Tov. We want to allow you to slaughter your animal. On the other hand, we don't want you to do anything for no reason. So again, it's more of a probability. The probability of a regular animal or bird being a treifa is a much smaller probability. But in this case, it's a much higher probability, and therefore we won't permit it. Tanya, new braita. Echad mevi ta'or. Okay, again, this is going to eventually connect to the sugya we just had about the rafim, but first we're going to see something that seems unconnected or disconnected. This, first of all, it's talking about Shabbat. It's talking about cooking on Shabbat, which is a problem, right? If it was Yom Tov, this wouldn't be a problem at all. What if you have a cooking process that was performed by many different people? If you remember Masechet Shabbat, we learned about if a number of people do one melacha together, they're not liable. So here, they bring a case. Echad mevi ta'or. One person brought the fire. Echad mevi ta'itzim. The next person brought the wood. Echad shofetet haktera. The next person put the pot on the fire. The next person, echad mevi hamayim, put the water in the pot. Echad notem b'tochot tavlin. Another person threw spices in. Echad megis. The next person mixed. Kulam chayavim. They're all liable because everybody did a melacha, either burning, right? They made a fire, havara, or cooking. Okay, I'm kind of ignoring one, but we'll get to that in a minute. The Gemara is going to ask about. But almost everything in that category falls into either making a fire or cooking. So now they say, wait a minute, v'hatanya, but there's another braita that says, acharon chayav v'kulam p'turim. Only the last one is liable and everyone else is exempt. So the Gemara says, how do we resolve that contradiction? Lo kashya, hada'aite or mi'ikara, hada'aite or levasof. If you do it in the order that we described in the first braita, then everyone's going to be liable. Because if you bring the fire in the beginning, then everybody is liable for doing something. But what if the last person brought the fire? So somebody brought wood, somebody put a pot on top, somebody put water in the pot, spices in the pot, right? Mixed it, but they didn't cook anything. So if they didn't cook anything, right, then obviously you're not going to be responsible. Only the person who then lit the fire, which then caused everything to cook, right, that person's going to be liable. So now they say, okay, let's go back to the first list of items. So they say, Bishlama, we understand kulu ka'avdei ma'aseh, right? We understand everything you mentioned in that list was either cooking or lighting a fire. But ela shofetet hakdera mai ka'avid. The person who puts the pot onto the fire didn't do anything. There was nothing in the pot. You're not liable for cooking an empty pot, right? So remember, there was the fire, the wood, and then the pot. Why should he be liable at all? So Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Hacha bikdera chadasha askinanu mishum libun ra'afim naguba. And here you get our connection. It must have been a brand new pot, and what he was doing was hardening the pot. And that's what the issue was. Okay. Moving, if we're already on the topic of new ovens, utensils, things like this. So Tanu Rabbanan, Tanur, and they bring another braita that connects a little bit. Tanor v'kirayim chadashim, if you have a new oven or burners, harehen kekol hakelim hanitalim b'chatzer. If they're new, you're allowed to carry these on Shabbos. Why? Because they're usable for other things. You have a tanur. It's basically like a closed area that you can put things to store inside. So since they have other uses, they're not considered muktze. You can use them. Aval. What they mean by kelim hanitalim b'chatzer, that means they're not muktze. You can carry them in your courtyard. Where can't you carry them? Obviously in the public domain. But you can carry them in your courtyard, right? That's the difference between carrying and muktze. Right? Muktze can be carried in your own courtyard, whereas things that are not muktze, right, can't be carried at all. Things that are muktze can't be carried even in your courtyard. Aval, however, what can't you do? Ein sachinotam b'shemen, as you can't do anything that prepares them for use. What has to happen to prepare them for use? People would rub oil on them, like to grease them. So you can't do that on Shabbat. Ein tashinotam b'matlit, you can't brush it with a cloth, like wipe it down, because that shines it. It's also part of the process they would do. Ve'ein mefiginotam b'tzonein kedei lechasman, and if it's hot, you can't cool it down by pouring cold water on it, because again, that's what they would do in the process of preparing it. You would heat it up, and then you pour cold water on it, and that would harden the oven. However, and this again goes into your intent and davar she'eino mitkaven and all that, v'im b'shvil le'efot harei ze mutar. Right, this is, by the way, where I've said Shabbat, but really it's a Yantif issue, obviously, from the end of this, right? Everything else could be relevant Shabbat Yantif, but if it's to cook in it, in other words, if, let's say, you want to bake in that oven and it's too hot, it's going to burn your breads. So if you pour cold water to cool it down so that you can bake in it, then it's okay. So for that purpose, it's allowed, because that, again, is ochal nefesh. Tanu Rabbanan, some other issues. Now we're moving into a little bit of different issues. We're talking about animals and the hide of the animals. Now, dealing with the hide of the animals could appear like melacha of me'abed, of processing the leather, right? The hide of the animal is like processing leather. So the question is, what are you allowed to do on Yantif with the hide of the animal that could be perceived as processing? On the other hand, you're really doing it for food. So one of the things people would do when they would eat, right, when they would slaughter an animal, is take off the hairs on the animal, because you don't want to eat that. So molgin et harosh ve'et haraglayim, this braita says, okay, we're basically, until we get to the next Mishnah, we're just quoting braitas with different halachot. They have to do with things that are either permitted or not permitted on Yantif for various reasons. So you can scald the head or the legs of the animal, tarosh ve'et haraglayim, or you can singe them with a fire, okay, because in order to get off the hairs. However, you can't use any sort of depilatory creams, anything like lime, plaster that was, or dirt that they would use from the ground. Those were things that they used to put on the animal. Professionals would use this, okay? The issue here is that this is what professionals use to process the leather. So therefore, you can't do it, even though you're not doing it to process, you're doing it to remove the hairs. It looks like, this is maybe marat ayin even, looks like you're doing it the way an uman would do it, or it's also like uvdin dechol, like you're doing it the way it's normally done on a weekday. Ve'ein gozezin otam b'misparayim. You also can't cut it with scissors, because that looks like the melacha of gozez, of taking, right, shearing the sheep, taking hairs off the animal with scissors. Ve'ein gozezin et hayarak b'tisporet shelo. If already we're talking about cutting, another thing you can't do. Right? We all know that you have a gardener uses particular tools when he cuts things from the ground. So if, right, or a regular person has gardening tools. So since there's specific tools used for cutting something from the ground, if you use those, let's say you have vegetables that you already cut from the ground. They're not attached to the ground. Obviously, if they're attached to the ground, you can't cut them, because that's kotzer, which we already learned. You can't harvest, right? You're not allowed to cut anything off the ground. However, even if it's already off the ground, if you want to cut it, and instead of using a knife, you use one of these gardening tools that are usually used to cut it from the ground, that's forbidden also. Because again, it will look like you cut it from the ground, and then people will think, oh, maybe it's allowed, maybe I can do that. Because here, this person's doing it, and it's yantif, and it's ochal nefesh, and maybe I'm allowed to cut it off from the ground. Aval mitaknim et hakundus ve'et ha'akaviyot. These are vegetables that are very bitter. And if you don't cook them for a really long time, then they're not edible. So even though, now the next category is going to be things that are more work than normal. Okay, it's like a lot of work, and you might think maybe that kind of thing, right? Like you can cook eggs on Yom Tov because that's easy to cook, but something that will take you many hours, maybe you can't. No, even that you can because it's for the purposes of cooking food. Umisikim ve'ofnim beporni. Porni is a very big oven. So if you have this huge oven, you're allowed to light a fire and bake in it, even though, again, an oven, a very big oven, takes a much longer time to light, to make a fire in it and get the fire going, etc. But yet you're allowed because, again, it's ochal nefesh. Umechamin chamim ba'antichi. Okay, we're starting to learn about all these different tools that they, things that they had in their kitchens. You could use an antichi, which is a big vat, I guess, or something, where they would heat up a lot of water, even though theoretically you might not use all this water on Yom Tov and you'll have some left over, but since people normally heated water in that, you're allowed to use it for heating. The only thing you can't do in this large oven is if the oven was new, and now we know why they brought this up here, you can't use it because what might happen, this goes back to the Rafim, it might burst. And if it bursts, you've never used it before, don't use it now because there's a good chance it'll fall, it'll burst. I'm trying to think about the fact that, you build this oven and then the whole thing, right? There's like a good chance that your whole oven is going to be destroyed, right? We buy a new oven in the store. We're not really worried that the first time you use it, the whole thing's going to explode. But in those days, obviously, they were worried that if their oven might explode the first time you use it. And therefore, because of that concern, just like the Rafim, according to one of the versions of Rabbi Yochanan, you have to be worried about that. And then again, what would happen? You lit this big fire for no reason. Tanu Rabbanan. We're going to have two more braitot before we finish to the next Mishnah about different issues of things. The first one relates to, again, the ma'aseh uman, the way professionals do it and the way people who are not professionals do it. Ein nochim b'mapoach, aval nochim b'shvoferet. You can't fan the fire with a bellows, which is the normal, like an implement used specifically for that. But nofchin, you can fan it b'shvoferet, with a tube or something a little bit different, an atypical thing that you would use. Ve'en metaknim et hashipud ve'en mechadedin oto. You can't fix a shipud and you can't sharpen it. This is, by the way, this has to do with the machloket about machshirei ochal nefesh. Are you allowed to do things that are preparation for ochal nefesh or not? So, who does this side by? It actually could be either side. If you remember, the rabbis say you can't do things for machshirei ochal nefesh. Prep for your cooking, like preparing a shipud, a skewer, or, right, Rabbi Yehuda says you can. So either you say this matches Chachamim against Rabbi Yehuda, who says you can't do things for preparation, so therefore you can't fix the skewer or sharpen it. Or you could say this is Rabbi Yehuda, and it's a case where you could have done it yesterday, and you didn't do it yesterday, because even Rabbi Yehuda says you could do machshirei ochal nefesh, but only if it couldn't have been done yesterday. So if it already broke yesterday, or it was blunt, and you wanted to sharpen it, should have done it yesterday. So maybe it matches Rabbi Yehuda. Last braita before we get to the next Mishnah. There's different ways of understanding this, but you're basically cutting a reed open, either maybe to flatten it and use it. Remember we had the paper that they would put underneath the fish to roast it. So that's one option, or maybe to use as a skewer. But you can, this is a totally different thing, you can take a bunch of walnuts and put them in a cloth and smash them within this cloth. What's the issue here? You don't have to worry that maybe in doing so you're going to tear the cloth. And then it's tearing, which is a melacha, because the melacha of tearing is only in order to sew. Okay, this is different. This is tearing not in order to sew. This is tearing just, it's getting ruined. So that's not a problem. New Mishnah. Va'od amar Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, if you remember, what is this va'od? Some people say they don't actually have the word va'od, but va'od really relates to the previous Mishnah, where Rabbi Eliezer said, Notel adam kesam mishal fanav, that you can take a sliver of wood, to clean out your teeth. So, and furthermore, that was a heter. Furthermore, another heter of Rabbi Eliezer, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Omer adam ala muktze. Remember what the muktze is? The muktze is the place where they dried out the fruit. And we talked already about the fact that some fruits, right, there was stages of the fruit, and some people would eat them at an earlier stage before they were actually fully dry. If they're fully dry, then they're ready. But if they're not fully dried out and you want to eat them on Shabbos, you can stand Erev Shabbat. Again, in this Masechet, we're mostly talking about Yom Tov, but sometimes we get into things that have to do with Shabbat. You can stand on Erev Shabbat, Bashvi'it, in the Shemitah year. This would be our year. We're in the Shemitah year. You can stand on an Erev Shabbat in the Shemitah year. We're going to talk in a minute about why specifically the Shemitah year, and is it only in the Shemitah year? We'll see. Not necessarily. Ve'omer mikan ani ochel lemachar. And you can say, I intend to eat from here tomorrow. And then it's not muktze anymore. Remember, the things in the muktze, it's very easy to remember. They're in the muktze, that means they're muktze, because you basically put them aside until they're ready. But at this point, you're coming to say, even though they're not ready, I plan to eat them as is. Okay? I'm impatient, or I don't have enough food in the house, or I'm planning to eat these. So you go there and you say, I plan to eat from here tomorrow. No problem. You can eat from there any ones you want. Rashi points out, if you look at the Rashi, Dibur Matchil, V'omer Mikanani Notel Machal, he says, V'sage Bahachi de Yesh Breira. That's sufficient because Rabbi Eliezer holds there's Breira. Remember Breira? Retroactive designation. What he's saying is, you can go there, even though you have a huge amount, because probably when they dried out a lot. You're not planning to eat all of them on Shabbat, but you can say, I plan to take from here tomorrow, and therefore, when you go the next morning and you go up to your roof and you take some of the fruits, you can claim now that what I'm taking now was the ones I intended yesterday. That's how Breira works. So the rabbis who don't hold Breira, Chachamim Omrim, Ad shirshom v'yomar mikan va'ad kan, until you designate. You have to put up, Rashi says, a siman, some sort of, maybe a little barrier, and designate these specific ones. Because the rabbis hold, Rashi says, to aim breira. They don't hold by retroactive designation. Therefore, you can't just say, I'm going to take from here tomorrow. You have to go and designate exactly what you want. Okay, let's go back to this Shvi'it, though. There's something in this Mishnah we didn't understand. Why specifically on the Shvi'it? And what other issues are there in this Mishnah? So let's read Rashi. Erev Shabbat Shvi'it, she'ein ma'aser noheg ba. Oh, this is a big ma'aser issue. Okay. We're going to get a little background, which is, what obligates you to ma'aser your fruits, right? To have to take the trumot ma'asrot. Remember, there has to be what we call gmar melacha. It has to be a finished product. And we're going to learn today and the other thing is you bring them into your house. Now, if you bring things and it could even be your courtyard. If you bring things into your courtyard or your house, you're already chayiv in maaser. We're going to learn later, though, not if you brought them into dry. Because if you brought them into dry, you're basically saying, I'm not planning to eat them now. So you're not obligated in trumot masrot yet. Which means, by the way, that if you nibbled on them and you ate them achilat arai, okay, which is like a light snack, okay. For example, if I'm outside my house and I pick some fruits and I don't bring them in my house and I eat them right there, I don't have to take the trumot masrot. Only when I bring them in the house, once I'm obligated, then I have to take them. But if it's before that stage, I can actually eat them without taking maaser. So now, what's the issue? The issue is that these didn't have gmar melacha yet, right? Because they weren't ready. And then what you said is, I plan to eat them. Now, once you're going to eat them, okay, you're going to eat them on Shabbat. Now, here it's a little tricky. Shabbat, there is no such thing as eating arai, okay? There is no such thing because of the pasuk. We're going to see it inside soon. V'karata the Shabbat oneg. Oneg we always associate with food, right? We call like an oneg Shabbat, and we invite people and we have food, okay? Oneg is food. Enjoy your food, right? That's why we eat meals on Shabbat. And because of that, any meal you have will be keva. So if you want to eat these fruits on Shabbat, you're going to have to maser them, okay? Either because you're going to say this is gmar melacha, or because you're going to say, because I'm eating not achilat arai, and the only thing you can do with those fruits is eat them arai. If I decide I'm in my garden, and I took the fruits off the tree, and I took a ton of them, and I decide to eat a full meal of fruits, I can't do that outside, okay? That I'm not allowed, because it's a real meal. So, obviously, where you draw the line, that's a whole question. I'm not going to get into that, but theoretically, right, this concept of a regular meal rather than a snack, right, which we were familiar with from Sukkot. So now, if I stand in Erev Shabbat B'Shvi'it, what's the beauty of the Shnat Shmita for this halacha? So again, going back to Rashi, ein maser no hegba, and therefore, the only thing between me and eating these fruits, you don't have to take Trumot Masrot on the Shemitah year. Okay, you don't, because right, there's all sorts of reasons about it, but there's no maser on the Shemitah year. First of all, you're not working the land, right? We're not going to make you whatever little you have to collect. We're going to make you give to other people, right? That's one of the reasons. Plus, everything's hefker anyway, like everything is ownerless. But in any case, you don't do. So I see someone's asking a practical question, which is, so it's a little bit trickier than this about not taking Trumot Masrot in the Shemitah year. First of all, it's not true for Heter Mechira, okay? Because I'm pretty sure it's not true for Heter Mechira, I would assume. But when it comes to vegetables, it's during the Shemitah year, right? Because vegetables go by when you collect them. And when it's actually a good question about the Heter Mechira. I'm not sure what the Heter Mechira situation is with that. But if you're talking about your garden, for example, so anything in your garden this year that's vegetables that grow this year, vegetables, spices, all that. Well, spices anyway usually are exempt from Trumot Masrot depending on what it is. But anything you cut, it goes by when you cut them, and that is what determines. So that's this year. Any fruits go by when they budded. So it's more going to be next year. Not all the shemita produce. So all your fruit trees are going to be either toward the end of the year or next year. They're not. You don't have to do Trumot Masrot on them. Okay, you also can't collect a whole bunch and bring a huge yivul into your house because they're shemita, and there's all sorts of issues about them. They have kedusha to them, but you don't have to actually take Trumot Masrot. The issue of Heter Mechira right now, I don't know why. I don't know what the answer is to that. It's a very good question. Okay, so now I would assume actually you don't. I mean, I don't know, right, when you would be in a situation of Heter Mechira. If there's Heter Mechira, then, you're not, I don't know, I'm trying to think. And then you buy Heter Mechira, it would snuva, whatever it would be, they would take care of it. But I assume you don't need to take Trumot Masrot because it's the year that determines. Anything that grows that year, you don't need to. So I would assume not. Okay, so now, Rashi now goes on further to say, so now Rashi points out, remember you can't take Trumot Masrot on Shabbat, so therefore you can stand on a year where you don't have to take Trumot Masrot, and all you have to do is say, I'm going to take from here tomorrow. That's called Hazmana. You've already said these aren't muktze, and now, on Shabbat, you can eat them because you don't have to take Trumot Masrot. On a regular year, you wouldn't be able to do that because you'd also have to take the Trumot Masrot. And now Rashi goes a little more into detail and says, well, it would also be true, even though it said shmita, not shmita, it would also be true, huadin bebe'usav ubishar shnei shavua. It would be the same thing on a regular year if you already took Trumot Masrot. Now, it could theoretically be that you've already taken Trumot Masrot. Why did they say this case then? Say, this was talking about a regular case. Most people didn't take the Trumot Masrot until they fully dried out. And therefore, likely you haven't taken Trumot Masrot, and therefore this would only be relevant in a year where you didn't have to take Trumot Masrot. Otherwise, you'd have a separate problem, which is you'd have to take the Trumot Masrot on Shabbat, and that would be a problem. Okay, or theoretically, you could do it when you say, I'm going to take from here, and then you could do your Trumot Masrot right then. That's also a possibility. Okay, now let's move on to the Gemara. The Gemara, what it's going to do is we're going to leave our topic. We're still on the topic of Masrot. We're going to quote two Mishnayot of Masrot. We're going to have a question, an answer, a question about the answer, and then someone who's going to say, we can prove this answer from our Mishnah, and then the Gemara is going to reject that. That's basically our flow for the rest of the stuff. Tanan Hatam. So we're going to quote two Mishnayot from Masrot. The first one says, Shabbat, and a lot of the background for these Mishnayot I already told you. So children that they buried figs in the field on Erev Shabbat. Okay, they didn't yet come into their house, so they weren't obligated in Maser yet. V'shachachu v'lo isru. But what's the problem? They designated them for Shabbat. They wanted to eat them on Shabbat, so they hid them in the field so that they'd be there for where they wanted them for the next day. But then they didn't take the Masrot on them. Now again, what do we learn from this? Shabbat kovat lemasir. That means they're not allowed to eat these without taking Masir, because they decided we were going to have even just deciding you're going to have a meal on Shabbat with these fruits, that already means eating keva right? A real meal, that means you're going to have to take the maser. And they didn't. So now, it says, L'motzei Shabbat lo yochlu elim ken isru. Even though you didn't even end up eating these on Shabbat, just thinking I'm going to eat them on Shabbat, turned these into keva, which means even, of course on Shabbat you can't eat them because you can't take truma to masrot, and you didn't. Even after Shabbat, even though these never went into the house, right? They didn't have gmar melacha, you have to meiser them because you've already determined these are for Shabbat. Now Rashi points out that why does it talk about a child here? It's to tell you, really it would be the same if it was a grown-up, right? We saw that case the other day about a woman doing it. I said it would be the same as a man. You could just say, maybe this is something typical children do. But Rashi says we can learn from this something further, which is, you might have thought the thoughts of a child aren't important because children don't have da'at, right? They don't have your ability to, in all sorts of things in halacha because of that. They're too young. So you might have thought their machshava doesn't mean anything, the fact that they decided we're going to eat them on Shabbat. So Rashi says this comes to tell you that the machshava of a child is enough if it comes with an action. And since there was an action associated with it, which is they buried it, or and I assume they didn't bury it under the ground because then it would be muktze, you wouldn't be allowed to move the dirt, but they hid it behind a tree, let's say. So because their action goes with their thoughts, that's actually enough, even though it was a child. Okay? So fine, that's an aside. Next halacha. Utna nami, another Mishnah. Hama'avir te'inim b'chatzero liktzot. If you bring figs into your field to dry out, banav u'bnei beito ochlim mehen arai u'pturin. Okay, your family members can eat arai, snack on them, right, without being chayav v'maser, because even though you brought them into your courtyard, this is what we saw before, bringing them into your courtyard only sets you, right, that you're obligated in a maaser in a regular case, but not if there isn't gmar melacha. Now, these figs are fully ready. However, your intent, again, this is how much intention plays in, your intent is to dry them. That means for what you want them for, there's no gmar melacha. So that overrides the law of chatzer determining maaser. No, in this case, not. If there isn't gmar melacha, then no. So now comes the question. So what they're setting up here is there's a parallel between Shabbat and Chatzer. Okay? Because Shabbat determines gmar melacha. Shabbat determines, chiyuv maaser, even if there isn't gmar melacha. Or it seems like, okay, we'll see in a minute. And, or even if you haven't brought them into your house, let's say. And Chatzer, bringing into your house, determines chiyuv maaser, right? Just like Shabbat. However, what do we see in this law about Chatzer? That let's assume Chatzer and Shabbat are the same because they both cause Maaser to be, right, say, now you're obligated in Maaser. But we see that there's an exception to the rule with Chatzer. If there isn't gmar melacha, if you haven't, right, you're planning to dry them, then it doesn't obligate you. So they want to know, by mine Rava me Rav Nachman, Shabbat, would it be the same for Shabbat like Chatzer, like we saw in the second Mishnah? As they brought the first Mishnah to show you that Shabbat establishes chiyuv maaser even if you haven't brought it into your house. Likewise, Chatzer, bringing it into your house, also obligates you in maaser. But when you bring it into your house, you're exempt if you're planning to dry them out. And there isn't gmar melacha yet. They're not fully ready. So would that be the same for Shabbat? If they're not fully ready, then maybe they're not chayav and maaser. So here come the two, they're going to explain it a little bit better. Mi amrinan, do you say, here come the two sides of Rava's question. Do you say, kevan dechtiv, v'karata l'shabbat oneg, because it says, v'karata l'shabbat oneg, and therefore, any meal is keva, basically, kav'ah, v'afilu b'davar shelon gmar melachto. And the way Rashi says it, he has a good language. He says, in the end of Dibor matchil banavu b'nei beito ochlim mehen arai u'pturin, it says, mi have kechatzer o adifa mina. Is Shabbat stronger than Chatzer? Chatzer doesn't determine for Maaser if you're planning to dry them and they're not ready right now. But maybe Shabbat is stronger than that. Because of this karata the Shabbat oneg, maybe Shabbat's going to set something for Maaser, obligate you, even if it hasn't been completed yet. Okay, that's their question. O Dilma, or do we say, no, it's just like Chatzer. Dilma b'davar shenigmar melachto kavah, but b'davar shelo nigmar melachto lo kavah. Maybe it's only going to be if the item was ready for use. But if it's not ready for use, then no. Okay, we still haven't gotten to our Mishnah. Okay, right now we're just talking about this question. So what's his answer? Rav Nachman says, Amarle, Shabbat kovad bein b'davar shenigmar melachto, bein b'davar shelo nigmar melachto. Shabbat is stronger than Chatzer, basically. Chatzer doesn't determine bringing it into your courtyard, doesn't make it obligated in Maser if the produce is not ready, like, for example, you're planning to dry it, but Shabbat will. Okay, Shabbat's going to say you're obligated in Maser even if it's not fully ready. Okay, even if you put it to dry and it's not fully dry. So now, Rava says back to him, Amarle, ve'ema Shabbat umiyad ha'chatzer, ma chatzer eina kovad ela b'davar shenigmar melachto, af Shabbat lo tikba ela b'davar shenigmar melachto. Says, why don't you just say Shabbat's like Chatzer? Now, this isn't really a convincing argument. He's just saying, you didn't prove your answer, so I'm going to say, why don't you say the other option? So he's basically saying, I don't know why you wouldn't think Shabbat is equal to Chatzer. Why would you say Shabbat is stronger? Maybe Shabbat is exactly the same. So to which Rav Nachman answers him, I don't know if this is convincing or not, but he says, Amarle, limud aruchu biyadenu. Right? I can't prove this to you logically, but I have a tradition about it. This is what I've been taught. Shabbat kovat bein b'davar shenigmar melachto, bein b'davar shelo nigmar melachto. Shabbat is what determines whether or not it's had gmar melacha or not. Okay, so basically, we haven't had convincing answers yet. We've just had, right, this is the answer, to which Rava said, I don't know why you'd say that and not the other. He said, because I have a tradition. But now comes Mar Zotra. Amar Mar Zotra bereder Rav Nachman. He's the son of Rav Nachman. Probably wanted to prove what his father said. And he says, Af ananami tanin, I had to prove it from our Mishnah. Because what does our Mishnah say? Now remember, let's just go back to the Mishnah. You can stand on Erev Shabbat in the Shnat Shmita and say, from here I'm taking tomorrow. Now remember, what did we say? If it wasn't Shnat Shmita, right? Why did it say Shnat Shmita? Because if it wasn't Shnat Shmita, you'd have to take Trumot Maschot. And remember, these fruits were not fully ready. If they were fully ready, you wouldn't have needed to say, I'm going to eat from here tomorrow. So he says, Tama de Shvi'it, la bari su'arehu. The reason why it said Shvi'it, right, the reason why it said this halacha was to say it was in the Shemitah year when you didn't have to take Trumot Maschot. But, ha b'shar shnei shavua, hachinami da'asur, my timer, right, if it was any other year in the Shemitah cycle, not the 7th year, then it would be forbidden for you to do this because you'd have to take Trumot Maschot, which you can't do on Shabbat. So, my timer, what's the reason? Must be lav mishum de Shabbat kav'ah. What must be the reason in our Mishnah? It must be because you said, just like the kids who hid the vegetables to eat them, or the fruits to eat them. Likewise here, it must be that why you obligated Masrot, the fruits weren't ready yet. They weren't fully dry. It must be because you said, I plan to eat them on Shabbat. And Shabbat then determines, you're going to eat them on Shabbat, that means you're going to eat them as a meal, because any snack is already equivalent to a full meal. That must be the thing that obligates you. In which case, we've proven that Shabbat is kovea even in something shelo nigmar melachto, that's not completely ready. So here's his proof. However, the Gemara rejects his proof and says, lo. Shane hatam kevan da amar mikan ani ochel lemachal kava le'ilaveh. It's because you said, I plan to eat from here tomorrow, you basically said, these are ripe enough for me. These are ready for me. I plan to eat from them. If you had said, I plan to use them tomorrow, then it wouldn't. But since you said, I plan to eat from them, that means they were clearly ready for you. You were basically saying, I think these are completed. I think they're completed in their growth. They're dry enough. They're good to go. Which means that you basically determined this gmar melacha, which means this case has gmar melacha, which means we can't prove anything about what they were trying to ask, about Rava's question. So then they ask, wait, if what determines it is the fact that you said, I'm going to eat from here tomorrow, and you're basically saying, I think these are ready enough for me, and the gmar melacha, well then ihachi, my iriya Shabbat afilu b'chol nami. Then this law should be applicable on a regular day as well. In other words, again, if you're focusing in on the issue is that you're basically determining it's maaser, and the shvid is coming to tell you, well, since there's no obligation of maaser, therefore on Shabbat you can do this. Well, even on a weekday, you can eat it without maasering it, because, again, you're trying to say, yes, it's obligated in Trumot Maschot, but it was Shnat Shmita, so you don't have to. So the Mishnah could have spoken about a regular weekday as well. So they say, well, HaKamashmalan, what it wanted to teach you was something additional. De tevel muchanu etzel Shabbat, v'mavar v'tikno mitukan. what it wanted to teach you, now it doesn't directly say this, okay, but what they're saying is, it specifically brought an example of Shabbat because it wanted to teach you that even though it was talking about the Shvi'it where there is no obligation of Truma Maschot, and the question is how exactly you get this from here, but what they're saying is that, I just want to check one thing, is that what you want to say is like this. If you say, normally, if I can't take Truma Maschot on Shabbat, if I say I plan to eat from here tomorrow, right? Are those foods are not prepared for me? That's what we said, right? It's shemita year. Specifically, it's okay. But what they want to say here is that even if it's not the shemita year, and you were to say, I plan to eat from here tomorrow, and then, so you'd have to take Trumot Masrot, so you can't eat from there tomorrow. However, what if you anyway took Trumot Masrot against the law? Now remember, taking Trumot Masrot looks, remember we talked about it, one of the issues is it looks like you're fixing the fruits. It's like tikkun kli, but it's not really tikkun kli. So it's only forbidden by rabbinic law. Since it's forbidden by rabbinic law, if you actually fix them on Shabbos or Yantif, you take Trumot Masrot, it's actually not muktze. In other words, there's two issues here. What they're saying is by you saying beforehand, I plan to eat from here, you basically have prepared them. And therefore, even if you take the Trumot Masrot against the law, if it's, let's say, not the Shemitah year, and you took the Trumot Masrot, this would be muchan for you. So what the Mishnah is trying to point out is, by saying, I'm going to eat from here tomorrow, even if there's a Trumot Masrot issue, if you somehow get over the Trumot Masrot issue, which again, sometimes legally because it's a Shemitah year, sometimes illegally because you went against the law and took Trumot Masrot, those fruits are no longer muktze for you. Okay? That's what they're saying. Because it gave a Shabbat example, you can learn this. Now, it's a little tricky because it doesn't actually say this directly, right? But they're saying, because it was talking about a Shabbat issue, right? This is the part that's a little unclear. I just want to check one thing here. Right? They say here that it alludes to this law. Because it's talking about perot shvi'it, it doesn't really say this, but right. What they're saying is, since there's this right, tevel is muchanu etzel Shabbat, meaning even if it's tevel, which means that you haven't taken Trumot Masrot, it's prepared for Shabbat. So if you were to say this mikana ani ochal machar, and you took the Trumot Masrot against the law, the Mishnah, like again, hidden in the Mishnah is a reference to this, and that's why they wanted to say specifically a Shabbat example. But they theoretically could have brought a Yom Chol. It would have been the same thing on a weekday, because really what it's saying is that it's not talking about Shabbat Kovea L'Maser, even though there's not gmar melacha. What it's telling you is, by you saying I plan to eat these, that determines that it's obligated in Maser, even though they're not actually fully ripe, or fully dried, actually, in this case. So, by you saying I plan to eat these, that already makes them considered fully dry for your purposes, which means there's gmar melacha, which means you're obligated in Maser, and that then has nothing to do with, if you say, right, is Shabbat determined even when there's no gmar melacha? Well, can't learn that from our Mishnah. We still say that's the case, because Rav Nachman said, I have a tradition about it, but we don't really have a good way to prove it. This sugya is going to continue a little more into tomorrow, so we will pick up from here tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.